The Galactic Council had seen 1,000 species rise and fall. They had witnessed civilizations that could bend reality with their minds, races that existed as pure energy, and empires that spanned entire galactic arms. But they had never encountered anything quite like humanity. When the distress signal first reached Earth, it seemed like salvation. An ancient empire called the Dominion was expanding across the galaxy, consuming worlds and enslaving entire species. The Council needed soldiers, disciplined, honorable warriors who could stand against the Dominion's ruthless advance. They expected Earth to send its finest military minds, its most decorated generals, its most elite special forces. They didn't expect Earth to empty its maximum security psychiatric facilities. They didn't expect humanity to send the monsters that other monsters feared. They certainly didn't expect to discover that what they called total war was something humans had been perfecting for millennia, not as soldiers, but as survivors of a world that had bred predators wearing human faces. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes, to defeat a monster, you need to unleash something far worse. The Empire expected soldiers. Humanity sent psychopaths trained for total war. A story in 5 parts about what happens when a galaxy's call for heroes is answered by humanity's most dangerous minds. Dr. Sarah Chun had spent 15 years studying the most dangerous minds on Earth. As the chief psychiatrist at the Blackwater Maximum Security Psychiatric Hospital, she had interviewed serial killers, mass murderers, and individuals whose capacity for violence defied comprehension. She thought she understood the depths of human darkness until the day the sky cracked open and aliens fell from the stars. The Valdari ship descended through Earth's atmosphere like a falling cathedral, its crystalline hull refracting sunlight into impossible colors. When it landed in the Nevada desert, the world held its breath. First contact protocols activated globally as every government scrambled to respond to humanity's greatest moment. Ambassador Kethvar emerged from the vessel, his tall, ethereal form radiating the kind of nobility that fairy tales were built around. His species, the Valdari, served as mediators for the Galactic Council, and his mission was clear: recruit Earth's finest warriors to join the fight against the Dominion. The presentation he gave to the hastily assembled United Nations was both terrifying and inspiring. Holographic displays showed the Dominion's advance across the galaxy, entire star systems going dark as the ancient empire consumed everything in its path. Billions of sentient beings had already fallen under their rule, turned into mindless drones or worse. Your species has shown remarkable potential for warfare, Kethvar explained to the gathered world leaders. Your military history, while primitive by galactic standards, demonstrates a strategic cunning that could prove valuable. We seek your finest soldiers, your most disciplined generals, your elite forces. President Martinez of the Global Defense Union leaned forward. What exactly are you asking of us? Send us 10,000 of your best warriors. Train them in our ways, arm them with our technology, and let them stand with the Council against the darkness that threatens to consume all free worlds. The room buzzed with excitement and concern. General Thompson, representing the combined Earth forces, spoke up. Our military is among the finest in our world's history, but we're talking about space warfare, technologies we don't understand. How can we possibly make a difference? Kethvar's expression softened with what might have been pity. Your species has never known true warfare. The conflicts you call wars are barely skirmishes by galactic standards. But your tactical flexibility and unpredictability have caught our attention. Most species develop along predictable lines: honor-bound warriors, hive-mind tacticians, technological supremacists. Humans seem to possess an unusual capacity for adaptation and creative problem-solving. Over the following weeks, recruitment centers opened worldwide. Military personnel lined up by the thousands, eager to represent humanity among the stars. Elite special forces, decorated veterans, strategic masterminds, all submitted themselves for consideration. The selection process was rigorous, involving psychological evaluations, combat simulations, and interviews with Valdari assessors. Dr. Chen watched the proceedings with growing unease. As a consulting psychologist for the recruitment process, she noticed something troubling in the Valdari assessments. They kept rejecting candidates who displayed what humans considered ideal military virtues: honor, discipline, loyalty to rules of engagement. Instead, they seemed drawn to individuals who showed flexibility in moral reasoning, comfort with ambiguity, and what the military euphemistically called unconventional thinking. It was during a routine evaluation of rejected candidates that Chun made a connection that would change everything. The psychological profiles the Valdari found most intriguing weren't those of soldiers at all. They matched patterns she knew intimately, patterns she'd spent her career studying in maximum security psychiatric facilities. She ran the comparison algorithms 3 times before accepting the results. The Valdari weren't looking for soldiers. They were looking for predators. Chun requested an urgent meeting with General Thompson and the Recruitment Oversight Committee. In a sterile conference room surrounded by security monitors, she laid out her findings. The selection criteria don't match any known military doctrine, she explained, spreading psychological assessment charts across the table. The candidates they're approving show high levels of compartmentalization, emotional detachment, and what we call utilitarian moral reasoning. These aren't the profiles of ideal soldiers. They're the profiles of functional psychopaths. General Thompson frowned. That's a serious accusation, Doctor. Are you suggesting the aliens are deliberately selecting unstable individuals? Not unstable. Quite the opposite. They're selecting for individuals who can remain perfectly stable while doing things that would traumatize normal people. They want humans who can make impossible choices without losing operational effectiveness. Colonel Sarah Hayes, the recruitment director, leaned back in her chair. Even if you're right, what's the alternative? The Dominion is real. The threat is real. If the galaxy needs soldiers who can do what normal soldiers can't, maybe we need to consider unconventional options. Chun felt a chill run down her spine. Colonel, I've spent my career studying individuals who can remain calm while inflicting unimaginable suffering. They exist, and they're currently locked away for very good reasons. What I'm suggesting, Hayes interrupted, is that we might need monsters to fight monsters. That evening, Chin sat in her office at Blackwater, looking out through reinforced windows at the facility that housed some of humanity's most dangerous minds. Her computer screen displayed classified files on inmates whose psychological profiles matched the Valdari preferences perfectly. Marcus Kane, convicted of 17 murders across 4 countries. His psychological evaluation described him as highly intelligent, strategically minded, and completely lacking in emotional empathy. He could plan complex operations with chess-like precision while remaining utterly indifferent to human suffering. Elena Vasquez, former military contractor who had tortured information from prisoners using methods that made experienced interrogators sick. She approached human suffering as an engineering problem, finding the most efficient ways to break minds and extract information. David Cross, whose murder spree had baffled authorities for years because of his ability to blend into any social environment. He could mimic normal human emotions perfectly while feeling nothing himself, making him virtually undetectable until he chose to strike. These weren't soldiers. They were apex predators wearing human masks, locked away because they represented everything civilization sought to contain. But as Chun read their files, she began to understand what the Valdari had recognized instinctively. They weren't just looking for fighters. They were looking for humans who could wage war without the psychological limitations that made warfare traumatic for normal soldiers. They needed individuals who could commit atrocities not in spite of their humanity, but because they lacked it entirely. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. General Thompson's voice was tense. Dr. Chun, we need you at the Pentagon immediately. The Valdari have made a specific request that you need to hear directly. 2 hours later, Chun stood in a secure briefing room facing Kethvar himself. The alien's usual composure seemed strained, and she realized this conversation was as difficult for him as it was likely to be for her. Dr. Chun, the ambassador began, we have been monitoring your psychological assessments of our selection process. Your insights are remarkably accurate. Then, you admit you're not looking for soldiers. We're looking for something your species calls soldiers, but which serve a function unknown to honorable warfare as practiced by civilized species. Kethvar's form shimmered with what Chun had learned indicated distress. The Dominion does not engage in honorable combat. They employ psychological warfare, torture, and methods of conquest that violate every principle of civilized conflict. General Thompson leaned forward. Are you saying we need to fight fire with fire? We are saying that species bound by moral constraints cannot effectively combat an enemy that recognizes no such limitations. We have tried deploying our finest warriors against the Dominion. They have all failed, not due to lack of courage or skill, but because they cannot comprehend the depths of cruelty required to understand their enemy. Chun felt the room's atmosphere shift as the implications sank in. You want us to deploy our criminally insane population as soldiers. We want you to deploy individuals who can think like the Dominion without being consumed by that thinking. Your species has produced individuals capable of extraordinary violence while maintaining operational functionality. This is not a common trait among galactic civilizations. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Colonel Hayes spoke. What exactly would we be asking these individuals to do? Kethvar's form darkened. Things that would destroy the minds of normal soldiers. Infiltration missions requiring them to commit acts that normal individuals would find traumatic. Psychological operations designed to break enemy morale through demonstrations of calculated cruelty. Strategic decisions that prioritize victory over honor. You're talking about war crimes, Chin said flatly. We are talking about matching the enemy's level of warfare. The Dominion has no concept of war crimes because they recognize no laws governing conflict. To defeat them, we need soldiers who can operate at their level without losing strategic focus. General Thompson rubbed his temples. Dr. Chun, in your professional opinion, could individuals like those in your facility actually function as effective military assets? Chun considered the question carefully. The individuals I study aren't mindless killers. Many of them are extraordinarily intelligent and capable of long-term planning. They can work within systems and follow orders when it serves their interests. But they're inherently unpredictable and motivated by personal factors rather than institutional loyalty. But could they be controlled? Managed, perhaps. Controlled? That's a dangerous assumption. These individuals don't think like normal people. They might follow orders that align with their nature, but they're fundamentally incapable of the kind of moral reasoning that makes normal soldiers reliable. Kethvar spoke again, his voice carrying what sounded like regret. Dr. Chun, we have observed that your species produces individuals who can function as what you might call ethical psychopaths, beings capable of extreme violence without emotional trauma, but who can be motivated by abstract concepts like victory, challenge, or even curiosity. This combination is extraordinarily rare among galactic species. You're asking us to weaponize mental illness. We are asking you to deploy a natural resource that evolution has provided. Most species develop either effective warriors who are traumatized by extreme violence, or beings capable of extreme violence who cannot function as effective warriors. Humanity appears to have produced individuals who combine both traits. The meeting ended with no decisions made, but Chin knew the direction things were heading. Over the following days, she found herself conducting assessments of Blackwater's most dangerous inmates, not to treat them, but to evaluate their potential as soldiers in an intergalactic war. The irony wasn't lost on her. Humanity's first contact with alien civilization hadn't resulted in a sharing of knowledge or culture. Instead, it had led to the discovery that Earth's greatest contribution to galactic warfare might be its most damaged minds. As she prepared psychological evaluations that would determine which monsters might be unleashed upon the galaxy, Chin wondered if humanity was about to become the very evil it was being recruited to fight against. But with the Dominion advancing across the stars and conventional forces proving inadequate, the question wasn't whether this was right or wrong. The question was whether it would work. Marcus Kane had been in solitary confinement for 3 years when they came for him. He had expected many things during his imprisonment, appeals, interviews, maybe another psychological evaluation. He had not expected representatives from an alien civilization to offer him a job. The meeting took place in a room he had never seen before, deep within Blackwater's administrative wing. 2 humans flanked a being that defied easy description, tall, luminescent, with features that seemed to shift slightly when he wasn't looking directly at it. Dr. Chun sat across from him, her expression unreadable but tense. Mr. Kane, the alien being began, its voice carrying harmonics that made his spine tingle. "I am Tactical Assessor Vexmore of the Valdari Republic. We have studied your psychological profile and believe you may possess qualities useful in our current conflict." Kane studied the being with the same analytical detachment he had once applied to selecting victims. "You want to recruit a serial killer for an alien war. That's either desperation or recognition of practical necessity." General Thompson, one of the humans present, shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Kane, you would be working under strict military supervision with clearly defined objectives." "General," Kane interrupted, his voice remaining perfectly calm, "I appreciate the attempt at traditional military framing, but we all know why I'm here. You need someone who can do things that would give normal soldiers nightmares." He turned to the alien. "What makes you think I would be interested?" Vexmore leaned forward. "Because the alternative is spending the remainder of your existence in a cell, contributing nothing to the universe. We offer you a chance to apply your particular skills on a scale that your previous activities could never match." Kane considered this. During his years of imprisonment, he had often found himself bored to the point of near catatonia. The stimulation of planning and executing complex operations was something he genuinely missed. "What would my role entail?" "Infiltration of enemy facilities where conventional soldiers would be detected or compromised by emotional reactions to the conditions they encounter. Psychological operations designed to create strategic advantages through fear and misdirection. Interrogation of captured Dominion assets using methods that standard military personnel cannot psychologically tolerate." Dr. Chun spoke up. "Marcus, you need to understand that accepting this would mean leaving Earth permanently. There would be no return, no contact with human civilization." Kane smiled, the expression containing no warmth whatsoever. "Dr. Chun, human civilization locked me away because it couldn't tolerate what I am. These beings seem to be offering me a context where what I am becomes useful rather than criminal." He looked back at Vexmore. "What guarantees do I have that I won't simply be disposed of when my usefulness ends?" "None," the alien replied honestly. "But the same could be said of any soldier in any war. The difference is that your survival would depend on continued effectiveness rather than adherence to codes of conduct that may prove inadequate against our enemy." Over the following weeks, similar conversations took place in maximum security facilities across the globe. Elena Vasquez was recruited from ADX Florence, where she had been serving multiple life sentences for torture and murder. Her interrogation techniques had been so effective that several intelligence agencies had classified her methods to prevent their proliferation. David Cross was selected from a psychiatric facility in Germany, where he had been confined after a psychological evaluation revealed him to be a perfect predator, capable of mimicking any personality while feeling no genuine human emotion. His ability to become anyone while remaining completely detached made him invaluable for deep infiltration missions. Dr. Chun found herself serving as the primary liaison between the human psychiatric community and the Valdari selection process. It was a role that left her questioning everything she thought she understood about treatment, rehabilitation, and the nature of human evil. "We're not healing these individuals," she confided to her colleague Dr. James Morrison during a rare break from the recruitment process. "We're evaluating them like weapons." Morrison, who had spent decades working with violent criminals, nodded grimly. "The question is whether that's necessarily wrong. If these individuals can prevent the extinction of human civilization, does their past history matter? It matters because we're making a fundamental assumption that may be incorrect. We're assuming that because they lack normal human empathy, they'll be effective against an alien enemy that also lacks empathy. But psychopathy isn't just the absence of emotion. It's a completely different way of processing reality." The training program began on a Valdari facility orbiting Jupiter. The human recruits were transported in specialized ships designed to accommodate their psychological needs. Individual quarters with extensive entertainment systems to prevent boredom, and monitoring equipment that could detect signs of destabilization before they became dangerous. Kane found the journey fascinating. For the first time in years, he was seeing new environments, experiencing novel stimuli, and engaging with genuinely alien intelligence. The Valdari had designed the training program with remarkable insight into human psychology, or at least the particular variant of human psychology they were working with. The facility itself was a marvel of adaptive architecture. Corridors could be reconfigured instantly, creating an environment where trainees never became too comfortable with their surroundings. This prevented the kind of territorial behavior that could lead to conflict between individuals who were, by their nature, predators. Training began with familiarization with alien technology. Kane discovered that Valdari equipment was designed to interface directly with neural patterns, meaning that weapons and tools could be operated through thought alone. For someone accustomed to careful planning and precise execution, the technology was intoxicating. The neural interface responds to intention rather than conscious command, explained Instructor Velkar, a Valdari who specialized in training alien recruits. For most species, this requires extensive meditation and mental discipline. Humans with your particular neurological patterns seem to adapt remarkably quickly. Kane tested the interface with a training weapon, finding that he could target and fire with accuracy that surpassed his already considerable skills. The weapon seemed to respond to his predatory instincts in ways that conventional firearms never had. Elena Vasquez excelled in the psychological operations training. Her natural understanding of human vulnerability translated surprisingly well to alien psychology, and she quickly began developing techniques for breaking the minds of captured Dominion forces. The Valdari instructors found her methods both effective and disturbing. Most species require significant conditioning to overcome emotional responses to inflicting psychological trauma, Velkar noted during one of her evaluations. Elena demonstrates no such limitations. Her approach to mental manipulation appears to be purely instrumental. She views psychological suffering as a tool to be employed with precision rather than as a source of ethical concern. David Cross proved most valuable in infiltration training. His ability to analyze and mimic personality patterns allowed him to convincingly impersonate members of allied species within days of first contact. The Valdari had never encountered a being capable of such complete psychological camouflage. He doesn't just change his behavior, reported cultural specialist Morvex. He appears to temporarily restructure his entire personality framework. Our psychological sensors cannot distinguish his mimicry from genuine emotional states. As training progressed, the human recruits began working together in small teams. This presented unique challenges, as normal military unit cohesion depended on bonds of trust and mutual care that these individuals were fundamentally incapable of forming. Instead, they developed what Dr. Chun termed functional cooperation, working relationships based on mutual utility rather than emotional connection. Kane, Vasquez, and Cross formed one such team, with each member recognizing the other's capabilities while maintaining complete emotional detachment. It's like watching a pack of wolves who understand they're all wolves, Chun observed during a team exercise evaluation. They can work together effectively because they have no illusions about each other's nature. The training scenarios became increasingly complex and morally challenging. Teams were required to complete missions that would constitute war crimes under human law, infiltrating refugee camps to eliminate hidden enemy agents, conducting interrogations using torture techniques, and making strategic decisions that sacrificed innocent lives for tactical advantage. Kane found these exercises intellectually stimulating in ways that his previous activities never had been. The scale and complexity of galactic warfare provided challenges that Earthbound serial killing could never match. He began to think of his past crimes as crude practice for this more sophisticated application of his abilities. The difference, he explained to Cross during a planning session for a particularly complex infiltration scenario, is that this has genuine strategic value. My previous activities were ultimately meaningless, artistic expressions, you might say. This is warfare as engineering problem-solving. Cross nodded, his personality for the day mimicking that of a thoughtful military strategist. The question is whether we can maintain operational effectiveness when the scope increases beyond anything we've experienced. Individual victims are one thing. Planetary populations are entirely different. Elena Vasquez had no such concerns. Scale is just a multiplier, she said matter-of-factly while calibrating a psychological warfare device. The principles remain the same whether you're breaking one mind or a million. Pain is pain. Fear is fear. Despair is despair. Dr. Chun watched these conversations through monitoring systems, documenting the psychological evolution of the recruits. She was witnessing something unprecedented in human psychology, the weaponization of mental illness on an intergalactic scale. Her reports to Earth grew increasingly concerned. "The training is working too well," she wrote in one classified assessment. "These individuals are not just adapting to alien warfare, they're thriving in it. The scope and technological sophistication are providing stimulation that their Earth-based activities never could. We may be creating something far more dangerous than we intended." The response from Earth was predictable. With the Dominion advancing across the galaxy and conventional forces proving inadequate, ethical concerns were secondary to practical necessity. The program continued. As training neared completion, the recruits began receiving briefings on actual Dominion capabilities and tactics. What they learned changed their understanding of the conflict entirely. The Dominion wasn't just another empire seeking territorial expansion. It was a civilization-consuming entity that transformed conquered populations into components of its collective consciousness. Beings who fell under Dominion control retained their memories and personalities, but lost all capacity for independent thought or action. "It's the perfect form of slavery," Kane observed after reviewing intelligence reports. "They don't kill their enemies, they absorb them. Every conquered world increases their capabilities while providing perfect internal security." Vexmore confirmed his analysis. The Dominion grows stronger with each victory. Conventional military strategies fail because they assume an enemy that can be defeated through attrition or negotiation. The Dominion recognizes no limitations and feels no losses. They are, in effect, a galactic cancer. This revelation recontextualized the entire training program. The human recruits weren't just being prepared for unconventional warfare. They were being prepared to fight an enemy that represented the antithesis of individual consciousness itself. Elena Vasquez smiled when she heard this, her expression containing the first genuine emotion any of the instructors had seen from her. "They're trying to eliminate the very thing that makes us what we are," she said. "Individual will, the capacity for independent choice, the ability to act against group interests, all the things that define human predators." For perhaps the first time in their lives, these individuals found themselves defending something they genuinely valued, not from altruistic motives, but because the enemy threatened to eliminate the very psychological framework that defined their existence. Training concluded with a final evaluation that would have horrified conventional military observers. Teams were required to develop strategies for defending a population center against Dominion infiltration, with full authorization to employ any methods necessary. Kane's team proposed a system of preemptive identification and elimination of potential collaborators, using psychological profiling to identify individuals susceptible to Dominion influence. Their plan included provisions for torture, execution without trial, and the use of terror tactics against the civilian population to maintain compliance. "It's monstrous," Dr. Chun reported to Earth. "But it's also probably effective. They're thinking like the enemy while maintaining enough independence to oppose the enemy's goals." As the human recruits prepared for their first combat deployment, Chin realized that humanity had succeeded in creating something unprecedented. Soldiers who could wage war without moral limitations while retaining enough individual will to fight for their own survival. Whether this would save human civilization or damn, it remained to be seen. The Kepler 442 system had been under siege for 8 months when the human operatives arrived. What had once been a thriving hub of interstellar commerce now hung on the edge of total collapse. Its orbital defense platforms reduced to debris and its population centers under constant bombardment from Dominion forces. Marcus Kane studied the tactical displays aboard the Valdari command vessel with the same methodical attention he had once devoted to selecting hunting grounds. The situation was, by conventional military standards, hopeless. The Dominion had established orbital superiority, controlled 3 of the system's 5 habitable worlds, and was systematically converting the captured populations into extensions of their collective consciousness. Standard protocol would be evacuation, explained Fleet Commander Torvel, his crystalline form flickering with patterns that Kane had learned indicated deep stress. "We have never successfully reversed a Dominion occupation once they achieve population conversion. The strategic mathematics are unforgiving. Elena Vasquez looked up from her analysis of captured Dominion communications. "You're thinking like they expect you to think," she said, her voice carrying the same clinical detachment she had once used when explaining torture techniques to horrified military psychologists. "They're not just conquering territory, they're harvesting minds. That's both their strength and their vulnerability." David Cross, currently wearing the personality of an analytical military strategist, nodded in agreement. The conversion process requires a specific psychological state in the target population. Fear, despair, and hopelessness create optimal conditions for integration into the collective. Change the psychological environment, and the process becomes unstable. Kane smiled, the expression containing nothing that could be called human warmth. "You want us to make the population psychologically incompatible with conversion." The Valdari commanders exchanged what might have been concerned glances. Fleet Commander Torvel spoke carefully. "What you are proposing would require. It would require turning the civilian population into something the Dominion can't absorb," Vasquez finished. "Something too damaged, too chaotic, too individually violent to integrate into a collective consciousness." The plan that emerged from their discussions would have been condemned as genocidal by any civilized military tribunal. Rather than evacuating or defending the remaining population centers, the human operatives proposed to systematically traumatize the civilians in ways that would make them psychologically incompatible with Dominion control. Kane outlined the strategy with the same methodical precision he had once applied to murder. The Dominion conversion process requires subjects capable of accepting external mental control. Individuals suffering from severe psychological trauma, particularly trauma that creates dissociative responses, cannot be effectively integrated. "You're talking about deliberately driving innocent people insane." Dr. Chen's voice came through the communication link from Earth, where she was monitoring the mission in real time. "We're talking about immunizing them against mental slavery," Cross replied, his current personality framework allowing for considerable moral flexibility. "The Dominion process requires functional neural pathways. Shattered minds can't be absorbed into the collective." The first phase began on Kepler 442c, a mining world where Dominion forces had established their primary conversion facility. Rather than attempting a direct assault, the human team infiltrated the civilian refugee camps that surrounded the facility. What followed defied every principle of psychological warfare as understood by galactic civilization. Instead of attempting to maintain morale and hope among the refugees, Kane and his team began a systematic campaign of targeted psychological destruction. They identified individuals who showed signs of potential collaboration with Dominion forces and subjected them to precisely calculated trauma designed to create permanent psychological instability. They spread carefully crafted rumors that turned families against each other. They introduced hallucinogenic compounds into the water supply that created lasting paranoid delusions. Vasquez established what she euphemistically called conditioning centers, where captured collaborators were subjected to psychological torture so severe that it fundamentally altered their neural patterns. The techniques she employed were refinements of methods she had developed on Earth, scaled up and enhanced with alien technology. "It's working," reported surveillance specialist Nexvar after monitoring Dominion conversion attempts. "Integration failure rate has increased by 400%. The Dominion controllers are reporting that process subjects are exhibiting chaotic mental patterns incompatible with collective consciousness." Cross had infiltrated the Dominion facility itself, mimicking the psychological patterns of a converted subject while retaining complete independence. His reports revealed the enemy's growing frustration with their inability to successfully process the refugee population. They're starting to question whether the population has been contaminated with some form of biological agent, he transmitted during one of his scheduled contact windows. They don't understand that the contamination is psychological rather than chemical. The success of the psychological immunization campaign exceeded all expectations, but it came at a cost that troubled even the Valdari commanders. The refugee camps had become places of horror where normal human beings were systematically reduced to barely functional psychological wrecks. Dr. Chen's voice carried increasing desperation during her communications with the team. "What you're doing to these people, it's not reversible. You're not just preventing conversion, you're destroying their capacity for normal human existence. Kane's response was delivered with the same emotional flatness he had once used to discuss his murder techniques. Dr. Chun, normal human existence ended when the Dominion arrived. We're creating a form of existence that can survive in a post-conversion environment. The second phase of the operation required even more extreme measures. Dominion forces had begun adapting their conversion techniques to account for psychologically damaged subjects, developing new procedures that could process even severely traumatized individuals. Vasquez's solution was characteristically direct. If damaged minds can be converted, then we need to create minds that are so fundamentally altered that conversion becomes impossible. She began developing what she called cascade trauma protocols, systematic methods of creating multiple personality disorders, dissociative identity syndrome, and other conditions that resulted in mental fragmentation beyond the Dominion's ability to integrate. The refugee camps became laboratories for applied psychological destruction. Families were manipulated into committing atrocities against each other. Children were exposed to carefully calibrated horrors designed to permanently alter their developmental psychology. Adults underwent procedures that left them functional enough to survive, but too psychologically fragmented to be absorbed into any collective consciousness. We're creating a population of human-shaped beings who can't be converted because they're no longer entirely human, Cross observed during one of his infiltration reports. The Dominion doesn't know how to process entities that exist as multiple conflicting personalities within a single body. The Dominion response was swift and predictable. Unable to convert the population, they began implementing extermination protocols. Orbital bombardment commenced against the refugee camps, with a clear intention of destroying what they could not absorb. This was exactly what Kane had anticipated. They're not just conquerors, he explained to the confused Valdari commanders. They're collectors. They can't tolerate the existence of minds they can't possess. By making the population unconvertible, we've forced them to reveal their true nature. The extermination campaign served the human operatives' larger strategic goals perfectly. Documentation of Dominion forces systematically murdering refugee populations was transmitted across the galaxy, destroying their carefully cultivated image as liberators bringing order to chaotic worlds. But the revelation of Dominion brutality was only the beginning. Kane had been studying their operational patterns with the same methodical attention he had once devoted to stalking prey. He had identified what he believed to be a fundamental weakness in their collective consciousness model. They're not just connected, he explained during a strategy session with the Valdari command staff. They're dependent. The collective consciousness requires constant reinforcement from all member minds. Remove enough component personalities, and the entire local network becomes unstable. Phase 3 of the operation involved infiltration of the conversion facility itself. Cross, still maintaining his mimicry of a converted subject, began introducing psychological chaos directly into the Dominion collective consciousness. Using techniques Vasquez had developed, he transmitted carefully crafted mental patterns designed to create cascading psychological failures throughout the network. The effect was devastating. Dominion forces throughout the system began exhibiting erratic behavior as their collective consciousness struggled to process the chaotic inputs Cross was introducing. Converted subjects started experiencing personality reversions, with their original identities temporarily reasserting themselves. It's like introducing a virus into their mental network, Cross reported. The collective consciousness is trying to maintain stability while processing inputs that are fundamentally incompatible with unified thought. Kane coordinated the final phase of the operation with the precision of a master predator. As the Dominion collective consciousness became increasingly unstable, he led targeted strikes against their key personnel, not to kill them, but to capture them alive for processing through Vasquez's trauma protocols. The captured Dominion commanders were subjected to psychological conditioning that left them functional enough to return to their forces, but carrying mental patterns designed to spread chaos throughout the collective consciousness. Like a psychological plague, the trauma they carried infected the entire local network. Within weeks, the Dominion forces in the Kepler 442 system were retreating in complete disarray. Their collective consciousness had become so destabilized that individual units could no longer coordinate effectively. The conversion facilities shut down as the controllers became unable to maintain the mental unity required for the process. Complete strategic victory, reported Fleet Commander Torvel, his form displaying patterns that Kane recognized as profound amazement mixed with deep unease. The Dominion forces have withdrawn from all occupied worlds in the system. But victory had come at a price that defied calculation. The population of Kepler 442c numbered fewer than 10,000 survivors from an original population of nearly 2 million. Those who remained alive were so psychologically damaged that they could barely be considered human. Dr. Chen's final report on the mission was classified at levels that ensured it would never be seen by civilian authorities. The operation succeeded in preventing Dominion control of the target population, she wrote. It accomplished this by destroying the population more thoroughly than the Dominion ever could have. Kane read her assessment with the same analytical detachment he had once applied to post-crime analysis. Dr. Chen doesn't understand the strategic mathematics, he said to his team as they prepared for redeployment. We didn't destroy the population. We transformed them into something the Dominion cannot use. Vasquez nodded in agreement. The survivors will reproduce. Their children will carry psychological patterns incompatible with collective consciousness. We've created a permanently immune population. Cross, shifting to a new personality framework for their next assignment, added his own observation. More importantly, we've demonstrated that the Dominion can be defeated using methods they cannot counter. Their collective consciousness model has no defense against individualized psychological warfare. The implications of their success were staggering. For the first time since the Dominion expansion began, an occupied system had been completely liberated. The victory had come through methods that no civilized military force could have employed, but it had been decisive and complete. As their ship departed the Kepler 442 system, Kane looked back at the world they had saved and felt something that might have been satisfaction. The surface of the planet was scarred by bombardment, its population reduced to barely functional survivors, its cities transformed into monuments to systematic psychological destruction. But it was free, and in a galaxy where the alternative was absorption into a collective consciousness that eliminated individual will entirely, even this hollow victory represented hope. The galaxy was beginning to understand that sometimes, to preserve what makes life worth living, you had to be willing to destroy almost everything else. News of the Kepler 442 victory spread across the galaxy like wildfire, but the celebration was muted by the horrific details of how victory had been achieved. The Galactic Council found itself in the unprecedented position of praising a military success while simultaneously being terrified by the methods that had made it possible. Dr. Chun received the first indication of how dramatically the war was about to escalate when she was summoned to an emergency session of the Council's Strategic Command. The meeting took place aboard the massive diplomatic vessel Harmony's Edge, a kilometer-long ship that served as mobile headquarters for the galactic war effort. The briefing chamber was filled with representatives from dozens of species, but the atmosphere was tense rather than celebratory. Admiral Korthek of the Zirian hegemony, a being whose crystalline carapace reflected the room's lighting in agitated patterns, spoke first. The human operatives have achieved what 3 years of conventional warfare could not, he began, his translated voice carrying undertones of disgust. They have forced a complete Dominion withdrawal from an occupied system. However, the cost in civilian casualties exceeds anything in recorded military history. Fleet Commander Torvel provided the detailed analysis. Strategic assessment confirms that the Kepler 442 operation eliminated 94% of the target population. While this prevented Dominion conversion of those individuals, it raises questions about the proportional nature of our response. Dr. Chun felt a familiar chill as she realized where this conversation was heading. You're considering expanding the program. We are considering survival, replied Chancellor Vexmore of the Valdari Republic. Intelligence reports indicate that the Dominion has accelerated their expansion schedule in response to the Kepler 442 defeat. They are targeting core worlds with populations in the billions. Conventional defense strategies have proven inadequate. The holographic display activated, showing a three-dimensional map of the galaxy with Dominion-controlled sectors highlighted in red. The expansion pattern was unmistakable. They were moving toward the major population centers of the galactic core, including Earth. "How long do we have?" Chen asked. 6 months before they reached the Centauri cluster, Admiral Korthek replied. 18 months before they reached the Sol system. At their current rate of expansion, all major population centers will be under their control within 3 years. The silence that followed was broken by strategic coordinator Nexvar, whose species Chun had learned communicated through harmonious tones that the translation software rendered as uncomfortably beautiful music. "The question before this body is whether the methods employed by the human operatives can be scaled up to defend entire star systems." Dr. Chen realized they were asking her to evaluate whether Kane, Vasquez, Cross, and the other human operatives could systematically destroy billions of minds to prevent their conversion by the Dominion. The scope was staggering. "You're talking about psychological genocide on an unprecedented scale," she said. "The trauma protocols used at Kepler 442 were designed for refugee populations numbered in the thousands. Scaling them up to planetary populations would require recruiting additional human assets," Chancellor Vexmore finished. "Dr. Chun, we need you to return to Earth and expand the recruitment program. We estimate that effective defense of the major population centers would require approximately 1,000 human operatives with psychological profiles matching your current team." The return journey to Earth took 3 weeks, during which Shun found herself reviewing psychological profiles of the most dangerous minds on the planet. Maximum security psychiatric facilities worldwide housed thousands of individuals whose capacity for violence and psychological manipulation surpassed even Kane's capabilities. But as she studied the files, she began to recognize patterns that troubled her. The individuals being considered for recruitment weren't just psychopaths or sociopaths. Many of them were suffering from complex trauma disorders that manifested as extreme violence. They weren't monsters by nature. They were human beings who had been systematically broken by experiences that exceeded their capacity to process normally. Dr. Sarah Martinez, incarcerated for a series of murders that defied conventional criminal profiling, had been subjected to experimental psychological conditioning as a child. Her capacity for violence was the result of training rather than innate pathology. Colonel James Harrison had been a decorated military officer until a classified psychological warfare program had fundamentally altered his personality structure. His subsequent crimes were expressions of conditioning that had been deliberately programmed into his mind. These weren't simply criminals. They were the products of humanity's own experiments in creating beings capable of extreme violence without normal emotional constraints. The recruitment program wasn't just tapping into natural human pathology, it was harvesting the results of decades of deliberate psychological engineering. When Shun shared these observations with the Recruitment Oversight Committee, the response was predictable but disturbing. General Thompson leaned back in his chair with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Dr. Chun, you've identified something that makes the ethical calculations much clearer," he said. "These individuals weren't just born with violent tendencies. They were created through human action, often by programs designed to serve military purposes. In a sense, we're finally using them for their intended function." "General, that's exactly what concerns me. We're not recruiting soldiers. We're deploying weapons that were designed to destroy human psychology. Using them against an alien enemy might be effective, but what happens when this war ends?" Colonel Hayes spoke up from her position at the conference table. "Dr. Chun, with respect, the question of what happens after the war assumes we survive the war. Current projections suggest that without significant expansion of the unconventional warfare program, human civilization will cease to exist within 2 years. The expanded recruitment program began immediately. Psychiatric facilities worldwide were systematically evaluated for individuals whose psychological profiles matched the requirements for psychological warfare operations. But as the program expanded, Chun began documenting phenomena that challenged her understanding of human psychology. Many of the recruited individuals demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in her professional experience. They could manipulate human psychology with precision that suggested genuine superhuman ability. Their capacity for violence was matched by intellectual capabilities that bordered on the extraordinary. Marcus Kane had been brilliant, but some of the new recruits displayed intelligence that seemed to operate on entirely different principles. Dr. Patricia Williams, recruited from a facility in Switzerland, could analyze and predict human behavior with accuracy that approached precognition. Her ability to manipulate group psychology was so sophisticated that she could create mass psychological phenomena through carefully orchestrated interactions with key individuals. Captain Michael Torres, formerly a Special Forces operative before his psychological breakdown, demonstrated tactical thinking that incorporated elements normal humans couldn't perceive. His operational planning included variables that other strategists couldn't even identify, yet his plan succeeded with mathematical precision. As Chun interviewed these individuals, she began to suspect that the recruitment program was accessing something more significant than simple mental illness. The psychological patterns she was documenting suggested that humanity had been developing capabilities that went far beyond normal human potential. Dr. Chun, Williams said during one of their interviews, her voice carrying the same clinical detachment Kane had displayed, "You're still thinking of us as damaged humans. That's a fundamental misunderstanding. We're not broken people. We're people who have been broken open. The damage you're documenting isn't a malfunction. It's an adaptation. An adaptation to what? To reality. Normal human psychology is designed to function within social frameworks that assume basic safety and predictability. When those assumptions become invalid, normal psychology becomes maladaptive. What you call pathology is actually enhanced functionality for environments where conventional moral reasoning creates vulnerability." This conversation was recorded and transmitted to the Valdari assessment teams, who found Williams's analysis remarkably similar to their own conclusions about human psychological evolution. Commander Vexmore's response was both illuminating and disturbing. "Dr. Chun, your species may have been unconsciously preparing for this conflict for generations. The psychological patterns we find useful in warfare against the Dominion appear to be evolutionary responses to environmental pressures that normal civilizations never encounter." The implications of this assessment were staggering. It suggested that humanity's capacity for extreme psychological violence wasn't an aberration, but an evolutionary adaptation to threats that other species had never faced. The recruitment program wasn't just identifying damaged individuals. It was accessing a subspecies that had been developing in parallel with normal humanity. Training of the expanded operative force took place across multiple facilities, with different groups specializing in particular aspects of psychological warfare. Kane's original team became instructors, sharing their hard-won expertise with recruits who often surpassed their capabilities. Elena Vasquez found herself teaching psychological destruction techniques to individuals whose natural aptitude for mental manipulation exceeded her own. "It's like teaching advanced mathematics to people who intuitively understand calculus," she reported during one of her assessment sessions. David Cross worked with infiltration specialists whose capacity for personality mimicry was so sophisticated that they could convincingly impersonate alien psychology patterns. "I can change my behavior to match any human personality type," he explained to Chun during a rare direct communication. These new recruits can change their fundamental cognitive patterns. They don't just act different, they think different. The first large-scale deployment of the expanded force took place in the Vega system, where Dominion forces had established their largest conversion facility outside their core territories. The target was not just military victory, but the complete disruption of Dominion expansion capabilities. What followed was psychological warfare on a scale that defied previous conception. Rather than focusing on individual populations, the human operatives began targeting the psychological foundations of entire civilizations. Dr. Williams led teams that infiltrated allied worlds, identifying populations that showed susceptibility to Dominion conversion and preemptively introducing psychological modifications that created permanent immunity. Her methods were more sophisticated than the crude trauma protocols used at Kepler 442, involving subtle manipulations that altered cognitive patterns without causing obvious psychological damage. Captain Torres coordinated strategic operations that turned entire star systems into psychological weapons. By carefully manipulating interstellar communications and trade relationships, his teams created cascading social destabilization that spread across multiple worlds simultaneously. The Dominion response was unprecedented. For the first time since their expansion began, they encountered resistance that they could not understand or counter. Their collective consciousness model, refined over millennia to absorb any form of organized opposition, found itself facing chaos that grew stronger the more attention they devoted to it. "They're trying to comprehend us," Kane reported during a mission briefing from the Vega system. "The collective consciousness is attempting to analyze our operational patterns using frameworks designed for rational actors. But we're not rational in any sense they can process." The success of the expanded operations exceeded all projections, but it came with costs that troubled even the most pragmatic military commanders. Entire populations were being rendered psychologically incompatible with normal social functioning. Allied worlds found themselves dealing with mass psychological destabilization that made conventional governance impossible. Dr. Chen's reports to Earth grew increasingly alarmed as she documented the secondary effects of the psychological warfare campaign. "We're not just fighting the Dominion," she wrote. "We're fundamentally altering the psychological basis of galactic civilization. The populations we're protecting are becoming as alien to their original selves as any Dominion conversion could make them." But as the war escalated and the Dominion advance slowed for the first time in their recorded history, such concerns became secondary to survival. The galaxy was learning that some victories could only be achieved by becoming the very thing you were fighting to prevent. The question was no longer whether humanity's psychological weapons could win the war. The question was whether anything recognizably human would survive the victory. 2 years after the first human operatives had been deployed, the galaxy stood on the brink of transformation. The Dominion expansion had not just been halted, it was collapsing. Across 1,000 worlds, the collective consciousness that had seemed invincible was fragmenting into chaos as psychological warfare techniques developed by humanity's most damaged minds spread like a virus through their networks. Dr. Chun stood in the observation deck of the Galactic Council's flagship, watching the liberation of the Dominion core world through long-range scanners. What she saw through the enhanced imaging systems would haunt her for the rest of her life. The planet's surface was intact, its cities undamaged by conventional weapons. But the readings from the psychological monitoring equipment told a different story. The collective consciousness that had controlled billions of beings for millennia was experiencing what could only be described as a psychotic break on a planetary scale. Marcus Kane's voice came through the communication system, his tone carrying the satisfaction of a predator who had finally found prey worthy of his capabilities. "Dr. Chun, you should be proud. The protocols your research made possible have achieved complete strategic victory. The Dominion collective consciousness has suffered irreversible psychological fragmentation." "Marcus, what have you done down there?" Elena Vasquez answered, her voice carrying the same clinical detachment she had maintained throughout her years of imprisonment. "We introduced a concept that their collective consciousness couldn't process: individualized suffering. Every mind in their network is now experiencing simultaneous trauma that prevents collective unity." The explanation that followed exceeded Chen's worst fears. Rather than simply disrupting the Dominion's conversion capabilities, the human operatives had turned their entire civilization into a weapon against itself. Using techniques refined over dozens of operations, they had introduced psychological patterns into the collective consciousness that created permanent internal conflict. "The beautiful thing about collective consciousness," David Cross explained from his position deep within the Dominion command structure, where he had been impersonating a high-ranking controller for months, "is that every mind shares the experience of every other mind. Introduce the right trauma patterns, and you can create cascading psychological failure across the entire network." Dr. Chen realized what they had accomplished. "You've given their entire civilization post-traumatic stress disorder." "More sophisticated than that," Kane replied. "We've given them incompatible trauma patterns. Every individual mind in the collective is simultaneously experiencing conflicting forms of psychological damage that prevent them from achieving unity. They can't disconnect from the network because their individual consciousness has been too damaged to function independently. But they can't maintain collective consciousness because the trauma prevents unified thought. The implications were staggering. The Dominion hadn't been defeated. They had been transformed into something that could no longer function as a civilization. Billions of beings were trapped in a state of permanent psychological limbo, neither individual nor collective, neither living nor dead. Fleet Commander Torvald's assessment was delivered with patterns that Chun had learned indicated profound moral distress. The Dominion threat has been eliminated. Their expansion capabilities are permanently disabled. However, the cost in sentient suffering may exceed anything in recorded galactic history. The celebration throughout the Allied worlds was muted by the growing realization of what victory had required. Liberation fleets arriving at former Dominion worlds found populations that were technically free but psychologically incapable of normal existence. The conversion process had been reversed, but the beings who emerged from collective consciousness were fundamentally different from what they had been before. Dr. Chen's final assessment of the war's outcome was classified at levels that ensured it would remain secret for centuries. Her conclusions challenged every assumption about the nature of victory and defeat. The human operatives have achieved total strategic success, she wrote. The Dominion expansion has been permanently halted, their conversion capabilities eliminated, and their core civilization reduced to a state of psychological chaos that prevents any future military threat. However, the methods employed have fundamentally altered the nature of galactic civilization. The changes went far beyond the obvious destruction. Populations that had been immunized against Dominion conversion through psychological modification were discovering that they could no longer function normally within their original societies. The trauma patterns introduced as protection against collective consciousness also prevented normal social bonding. Entire worlds found themselves dealing with populations that were individually functional but collectively incapable of forming stable communities. The psychological modifications that prevented Dominion absorption also prevented the kind of social cooperation that civilization required. But perhaps more disturbing was what had happened to the human operatives themselves. Exposure to galactic-scale psychological warfare had changed them in ways that exceeded even Chen's expertise to analyze. Marcus Kane had become something that defied classification. His capacity for strategic thinking operated on scales that normal human cognition couldn't process. He could plan operations across multiple star systems while simultaneously maintaining detailed awareness of individual psychological states among populations numbered in the millions. "I understand why the Valdari recruited us," he explained during one of their final communications. "They didn't want soldiers who could fight their enemies. They wanted minds that could comprehend their enemies. Normal human psychology can't process the scope of collective consciousness. Our psychological damage was actually an advantage. It allowed us to think on scales that intact minds cannot access." Elena Vasquez had evolved beyond her original capacity for individual violence into something that could manipulate the psychology of entire civilizations through carefully orchestrated cultural modifications. Her understanding of mass psychology had reached levels that bordered on prescience. "The war taught me that individual suffering is just a single note," she told Chen during their last interview. "Real psychological warfare is orchestrating symphonies of trauma across populations that span multiple worlds. It's art on a scale that earthbound activities could never match." David Cross had become something even more disturbing. His capacity for personality mimicry had evolved into the ability to actually become other beings at a fundamental level. He could temporarily restructure his neural patterns to match any form of consciousness he encountered. "I'm not sure what I am anymore," he admitted during a rare moment of what might have been genuine human emotion. "I've been so many different beings that my original personality exists only as one option among thousands. The question of which one is real has become meaningless." As the immediate war ended and the galaxy began attempting to rebuild, questions arose about what to do with the human operatives who had made victory possible. They had saved galactic civilization, but they had also become something that normal civilization could not safely accommodate. The solution proposed by the Galactic Council was both practical and horrifying. Rather than attempting to reintegrate the operatives into normal society, they would be given their own territory, entire star systems where they could exist without threatening the psychological stability of normal populations. It's exile disguised as reward, Chen observed during the final planning sessions. We're giving them kingdoms to rule because we're too afraid of what they've become to let them live among us. Kane's response to the proposal was delivered with the same analytical detachment that had characterized all his communications. Dr. Chun, you're still thinking of us as damaged humans who need to be fixed or contained. We've evolved beyond the psychological limitations that define normal human existence. Why would we want to return to a more constrained form of consciousness? The human operatives accepted their exile willingly, perhaps even eagerly. They had tasted existence on scales that normal human psychology couldn't comprehend, and the prospect of returning to Earth's limited scope held no appeal for them. But their departure left questions that would trouble galactic civilization for generations. They had proven that the most extreme forms of psychological damage could be transformed into weapons of unprecedented effectiveness. The implications for future conflicts were staggering. We've opened a door that can never be closed, Chen wrote in her final report. We've demonstrated that consciousness itself can be weaponized in ways that make conventional warfare obsolete. Every civilization in the galaxy now knows that psychological modification can create beings capable of destroying collective consciousness itself. The liberated Dominion worlds became a testing ground for rehabilitation techniques that might restore normal psychology to beings who had been subjected to both collective consciousness and its violent dissolution. Early results were not encouraging. Most former Dominion citizens were caught in psychological states that prevented both individual identity and collective unity. They existed in a limbo that was neither slavery nor freedom, aware enough to understand their condition, but too damaged to escape it. Some observers argued that this was simply the inevitable cost of liberation from collective consciousness. Others suggested that the cure had proven worse than the disease. The debate would continue for decades as the galaxy struggled to understand what victory had actually meant. As Chun prepared to return to Earth, she received a final communication from Kane and his team, now established in their designated star systems and beginning to build something that could no longer be called human civilization. Dr. Chun, you should understand that what we've become isn't a tragedy, Kane's message began. We've evolved beyond the psychological limitations that prevent normal humans from operating at galactic scales. We can think in terms of civilizations rather than individuals, plan across centuries rather than lifetimes, and manipulate consciousness itself as a strategic resource. The war didn't damage us, Vasquez added. It revealed capabilities that normal human psychology suppresses. We're not broken humans. We're the next phase of human evolution, adapted for existence in a galaxy where consciousness itself is a battlefield. Cross's contribution was characteristically philosophical. The question isn't whether what we've become is human. The question is whether humanity, as it existed before, could have survived what we've faced. Evolution requires adaptation to environmental pressures. The galaxy is an environment where normal human psychology is maladaptive. As Earth received the first reports of total victory in the Galactic War, celebrations erupted worldwide. Humanity had not only survived its first contact with alien civilization, but had proven instrumental in saving the galaxy from a threat that had seemed invincible. But Dr. Chin knew the true cost of victory. Humanity had saved galactic civilization by sacrificing its own humanity. The beings who had won the war were no longer recognizably human, and the galaxy they had saved was fundamentally different from what it had been before. The celebration would continue for years as the full scope of humanity's contribution to galactic liberation became clear. But Chen understood that they were celebrating the end of one threat and the beginning of another. Humanity had proven that consciousness itself could be weaponized. They had demonstrated that psychological modification could create beings capable of destroying any form of collective intelligence. The techniques developed to defeat the Dominion would spread throughout the galaxy, creating new forms of warfare that made conventional conflict obsolete. In saving the galaxy from absorption into collective consciousness, humanity had introduced something potentially more dangerous: the knowledge that consciousness itself was not sacred, that minds could be modified and weaponized, and that the boundaries between individual and collective existence were far more flexible than anyone had imagined. The war was over. The real struggle was just beginning. As Chen's transport departed the galactic core for Earth, she looked back at the star systems now controlled by the human operatives and wondered if they were witnessing the birth of something magnificent or the beginning of a nightmare that would consume everything they had fought to protect. Time would tell whether humanity had saved the galaxy or doomed it to a future where consciousness itself had become the ultimate weapon.